Joseph earned the favor of Pharaoh and was placed in a position of authority. The faith that carried him through the darkness was the same faith that kept him humble in success. It's not only in failure or struggle that the character of a man is tested. It's also tested by success. A life that seemed like a complete mess was only the beginning of his masterpiece.
Church family, some of you know Steve and Charmion Moore, longtime members here. I got to know Steve when I first came here 15 years ago. And at that point, Steve was a very successful businessman. In fact, he ran one of the largest concert promotion businesses in the country. You name any big star, whether it be country music or otherwise, chances are he organized their concert tours. He was very involved in the opening of Starwood Amphitheater. Well, a few years into his career, he went on a mission journey, and it changed him. And he still was a successful businessman. He saw that as a good and a high calling, but he could not get the faces and the needs of the place that he went out of his mind. He then came to Brentwood Baptist, and I met Steve, and he told me about what they do and this ministry that he started out of this mission trip. All these years later, if you talked with Steve, you may want to hear the stories of how he brought Paul McCartney to Nashville and how he did Dolly Parton's concert tours and the letters of inquiry he would receive from Buckingham Palace asking a certain someone to come and do a certain concert. But you know what he would want to tell you about? He would want to tell you about what really matters in his life. Because you see, some 20 years after first going to Guatemala, he saw the needs of that place. And through his contacts in the entertainment industry, he has started a pediatric surgical center in Guatemala. It's the best facility of its kind in that country. And for the last 3 years, through this ministry, over 1,000 children per year have received free medical care. Not just checking tonsils and blood pressure, but they partner with children's hospitals around the country, Denver Children's Hospital, Vanderbilt Children's Hospital, Duke Children's Hospital, and they bring surgical teams to this place. And the Guatemalan staff all year round travels the country, interviewing families and assessing medical needs. And so cleft palates and orthopedics and urology, you name it. If you saw him playing in the orchestra or walking down the hallway, you'd have no idea. In fact, we have a picture, not of him. He would not want his own picture shown. There's a little girl who was going into surgery, and her life has been changed. For Steve Moore, that is success. And your partnership in the gospel allows us as a church to equip each other, to encourage each other, and to fuel one another on toward love and good deeds. And then we, as a people of God, redefine for the world what success is. That is a powerful image. And that is a powerful connection to this part of the Joseph story. Do you find it interesting that the author of Genesis devotes a full 25% of the chapters of this first book of the Bible to this one character? Would you please stand with me as we read some verses from the 41st chapter of Genesis? The story starts in Genesis chapter 37, when Joseph is 17 years old. And here we are, 13 years later. So Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now Joseph left Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout all the land of Egypt. Now during the 7 years of abundance, the land produced outstanding harvests. Joseph gathered all the excess food in the land in Egypt during these 7 years and placed this food in the cities. He put the food in every city from the fields around it. So Joseph stored up grain in such abundance, like the sand of the sea, that he stopped measuring it because it was just beyond measure. Now, 2 sons were born to Joseph before the years of famine arrived. A Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, a priest at On, bore them to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, meaning, God has made me forget all my hardship in my father's house. As if he forgot it. He is remembering it right here. And the second son he named Ephraim, meaning, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Then the 7 years of abundance in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in every country, but throughout the land of Egypt there was food. Now, extreme hunger came to all the land of Egypt, and the people cried out to Pharaoh for food. What did Pharaoh tell all of Egypt? Go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you. Because the famine had spread across the whole country, Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Every nation came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, for the famine was severe in every land. May God bless the reading of his word. You may be seated. So if you have been here over the last few weeks, there's been this sermon series on the life of Joseph entitled Our Mess and His Masterpiece. And the story of Joseph is absolutely phenomenal. And I challenge you over these weeks, what if you became so familiar with the story of Joseph that you yourself would be able to tell it in 5 or 10 minutes? Don't just know where to find the story of Joseph, right? Embed it into your heart and mind, for it is a map for life. It is a map not only for your own life and God's plan for you, but also God's plan for his creation. So you know that Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob. Now Jacob later became known as Israel. So though he was not firstborn to Jacob, he was the favored firstborn of Jacob's favored second wife, Rachel, right? And as a 17-year-old shepherd, Joseph appears to us, right? The Bible does not tell us that Joseph was ill-motived, but the Bible does tell us that he went to go check on his brothers and came back and gave his father a not so flattering report on the brothers. And so this behavior, right, combined with Joseph's overt favoritism to Joseph, causes these older brothers to hate him. And that part about the coat, right, that did not help things either. Now, to make matters worse, Joseph then starts telling his brothers his dreams, these prophetic visions where Joseph says in the vision says that one day he will rule over his family. And this animosity towards Joseph peaks when his brothers who hate him plan to kill him. And now Reuben, let's not give him too much credit, he does advise against murder. He says, let's just throw him in the pit. And then they sell Joseph as a slave. Compounding the sin, they then deceive their father by telling their father that a wild beast had killed Joseph. So Joseph is now sold a second time, right? He was sold by his brothers to the Ishmaelites, and now the Ishmaelites sell Joseph to Potiphar, this high-ranking Egyptian official. And Joseph, because of who he is, his skills, his talents, his character, But more importantly, the fact that God was with him and had his hand on this person named Joseph. He becomes the supervisor in all of Potiphar's household. And he, Joseph, we read, he excelled at his duties. And he prospered in all that he did. Potiphar's wife notices him. And Potiphar's wife makes an advance on Joseph, and Joseph rebuffs her, and so she falsely accuses him of assault. And Joseph, although innocent, is cast into prison. So far, Joseph has been sold twice and has now been put away twice. Now, in jail, Joseph meets a baker and a cupbearer of the king, and they are disturbed with these dreams that they're having, and Joseph interprets these dreams, and both interpretations prove to be true. The cupbearer is later released from prison. Things don't work out so great for the baker, right? But the cupbearer is released from prison and promises to remember Joseph, but he forgets. But the story is not over. But 2 years is a long time to languish in prison. And 2 years after the cupbearer leaves Joseph's presence, he is back in good graces with Pharaoh. And now Pharaoh is disturbed and says, I have this dream of these 14 cows and these 14 heads of grain, and I don't know what it means. And no one could interpret the dream. And then the cupbearer remembers this guy Joseph back in prison. And so Pharaoh calls for Joseph. And Joseph comes into the presence of Pharaoh, and Joseph, he's ready. He is ready. Not only does Joseph interpret the dreams of the 14 cows and the 14 heads of grain, representing 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, but Joseph, if you read it in these verses, Joseph also gives Pharaoh a strategy for how to respond to the upcoming abundance and the upcoming famine. And in all of this, chapter 41, verse 16, before we picked up the story, Joseph gives God all the credit. What does Joseph say to Pharaoh? What testimony does he bear towards God? To Pharaoh, I am not able to. Joseph answers Pharaoh, it is God who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So Pharaoh hears Joseph and he says, done, you're it. And Joseph, he is ready. And Joseph overnight goes from zero to hero, right? He wakes up that day in prison and he goes to bed that night in a palace. From a 17-year-old slave in chapter 37 to a 30-year-old ruler in chapter 41, this, folks, would you not agree, is quite the ascendancy. It is quite the story of upward mobility. By any definition, at this point in the story, Joseph is successful. And who would not say here that success sure beats failure? But for those of you who are mature and wizened and somewhat seasoned, you know that success brings with it its own challenges and cautions. Maybe you have lived through some of these. That success, if you're not careful and if you don't steward it right, desensitizes you to your own fragility and your own sin nature. You begin to believe your own press and you begin to think that you're somewhat invincible. And yet, there is also the ironic discouragement of success, right? You have just accomplished something great and you realize that, oh man, I still feel kind of empty. Some of my relationships are still broken. These other problems still are not fixed. I mean, the success was wonderful, but at the end of the day, what is the point? Solomon, successful. Have you read Ecclesiastes lately? Some of us suffer from affluenza, not influenza. Affluenza, right? The disease of having too much and not knowing what to do with it and how to use it for God's glory. Would you not agree that in many cases, if not most, that prosperity has done more to hurt the church than adversity ever has? And you know how the list goes on. Arrogance, smugness, complacency, failure to learn and to listen, always thinking that you are the expert. Once you've tasted success, if you're not careful, you tend to lead from a position of power and authority rather than love and servant leadership. You're less likely to invite feedback because, after all, what can those people tell me about me and my life, right? The intoxication of success, where the ends justify the means, right and wrong get really blurry because ultimately that is not the ultimate pursuit. The ultimate pursuit is success itself. But in all of these chapters of Genesis devoted to the life of Joseph, it does not appear to us that Joseph succumbs to any of these things. Now, we would be quick to look at the life of Joseph as a how-to manual. How is he successful, and how can I emulate that? And that's not wrong, but there's a better measure of success than mere results, and that is one's character. You see, Joseph suffered. Joseph suffered repeatedly in his life, but do you notice in all of these chapters of Joseph, in Genesis about Joseph, the Bible never tells us that God was punishing Joseph for Joseph's sins. Joseph did not suffer because God was punishing Joseph for his sins, but Joseph did suffer so that God could ultimately save sinners. And you see, that is an indication that God is not only concerned about his plans for Joseph, but that God is also concerned about God's big plan. Do you know that in this entire Genesis account of Joseph, the Bible never ascribes to Joseph the sin of pride? Now, we know Joseph was not a perfect person. We know that no sinless person other than Jesus ever existed, but no sin in Joseph is ever identified in all of these chapters. And so Joseph, at this crucial point in his life, finds himself in prison. And we all have our prisons, real and imagined, and we know that prison is a terrible place to live, but prison is a phenomenal place to learn. And do you know that today, literally, we have brothers and sisters in this world, names unknown to us but known to God, who are not in a metaphorical prison or an emotional prison, as real as those are, but who are literally in prison for their faith. Over half of the Christians in this world, at some point in their life, will experience persecution. And do you know what persecuted Christians around the world tell us in America? They are so grateful that we are free from persecution. But they would hope that we will be good stewards of the freedom that we have, just as they seek to be good stewards of the prison sentences that they have. Aren't you glad that Joseph wasn't let out of prison too early? He needed, according to the sovereignty of God, to stay in that prison for that 2 years so that cupbearer would remember Joseph. And our persecuted brothers and sisters around the world, who, though sinful and in need of redemption, in our minds would not deserve the treatment that they have been given, they overwhelmingly do not pray for deliverance, they pray for faithfulness. If you were here last week, you met Rebecca Naylor, missionary surgeon to India. And time was short. She wasn't able to share this in this service. But in a previous gathering, she shared about some Indian pastors that she knows. And they have endured great persecution. And she says, though I lived in India, I never endured that sort of persecution. And she asked them, she said, how can we pray for you? And they said, don't pray that we're delivered. We're all going to die anyway. What an honor to die for Jesus. That sort of character, that sort of success, we see it in our Indian brothers, and we see it in Joseph. Joseph, great favor with his mother, great favor with Jacob, great favor with Potiphar, great favor with the prison warden, favor with Pharaoh, favor with the people, ultimately favor with God. Are you courageous enough to redefine success in your own life, not as the world defines it, but true success is in finding favor with God? What would your life be? What would God be able to do with your life instead of you pursuing success and looking over your shoulder and hoping that God will bless you in your pursuit of success? What if you pursued obedience? What if you pursued holiness? And then as the success follows according to God's plan, you give him all the glory and credit. This is how Joseph lived. If you look at this story of Joseph merely as a self-help guide, you will shortchange it. If your Christian experience and your relationship with Jesus is simply a matter of how he can help you have a better life, then you debase it. For if we are not careful, and again, this is what the persecuted church around the world can teach us, we do not use God, though we try. We are God's to be used. And you see, Pharaoh, in his lostness and in his pagan condition, it seems as if he picked up on this as he met and watched Joseph. In the 38th verse of chapter 41, listen to what Pharaoh sees in Joseph when he meets Joseph for the first time. This proposal that Joseph offered pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Then, verse 38, Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find anyone like this? A man who has God's Spirit in him." What if that could be said about you in your house? What if that could be said about you in your workplace? Hey, that guy, God's Spirit. Hey, that gal, God's Spirit is in them. That is success. Now, we have another clue into the heart and mind of Joseph. You know, the story unfolds, right? The land of Egypt and lands all around it, many countless thousands of people are saved because of Joseph's obedience and God's sovereignty. His family is reunited, and at the pinnacle of the story, right? Joseph is reunited with his family. The masks come off. They figure out who he is. They are absolutely terrified. And in verse 38, I think, of chapter 50, Joseph says to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me, but God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. So, as you seek to define success in your own life, here's the question to ask. How can one so poorly treated cultivate such a heart of forgiveness, humility, and God-centeredness? It was not primarily his personality or his giftedness or even his life circumstances. You see, what allowed Joseph to be this kind of person was itself a gift from God, because Joseph was graced with the ability and the power to think rightly about God and to live rightly with God, the same power that is in all of us. And in those moments, whether he was sold on the trading block as a slave in an Egyptian marketplace, or years later orchestrating the economics of Egypt and the marketplace in great failure and in great success, he knew that he was God's and God would do whatever he wanted, and Joseph was okay with that. Even how he named his sons reminded others of God's control in his own life. You see, my friends, Joseph knew that God, yes, did have a plan for Joseph's life. But Joseph was also concerned about God's plan. There's a difference. You see, most of us as Christians, we tend to be most concerned with God's plans for me. And there's a place for that. I do not quibble about Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you. It's a great verse. It's a powerful verse. I met someone this week, this young sister, and she had it tattooed on the top of her foot. So as I'm talking to her, I'm able to read Jeremiah 29:11. I mean, it's a powerful verse. But do you know the context of that verse? God was talking to the people about God's plans for the world. Now, are you part of the world? Absolutely. Is God concerned about you? Yes. Is God concerned about me? But a maturing Christian is not only concerned about God's plans for me, we are to be concerned about God's plan. God's plan for creation, God's plan for his people, God's plan for the world, and yet so many of us have no time, margin, or energy for that because we have found ourselves very preoccupied with how God can serve me. Joseph served God, and Joseph served God's plan. So you see, folks, success, Pharaoh was right. Joseph had God's Spirit in him. Joseph, chapter 50, was right. What people meant for evil, God meant for good. Not just for Joseph's good, but for the good of others, right? Many were saved because of the plan that God orchestrated through Joseph and for God's glory. I might be overstating this, but I think the church in America is enduring some collective angst that maybe we've not ever experienced since the Vietnam War, maybe World War II, certainly not since September 11th, which we mark next Sunday, 15th anniversary. The church in America, man, I hear a lot of fear. I hear a lot of questioning. I hear a lot of retreat mentality that we have somehow lost. Does God lose? What part of the Bible is that in? God doesn't lose. God is not up there scratching his head like, oh, I didn't see that one coming. Some of us might feel that the church in America is entering an age of persecution. We don't seek that, but would that be such a bad thing? Are we enduring persecution or are we enduring judgment? You can talk about that over Sunday lunch, okay? There's a lot of angst. It's an incredible opportunity. God is speaking, and God is stirring the napping, sleeping American church. You see, God had a plan for Joseph. And what if Joseph hadn't been bought and brought to Egypt? What if he hadn't been put in prison and not met the baker and the cupbearer? What if he happened to have been released from prison too early? Every detail orchestrated by God. But do you understand that your life is part of a bigger plan? a plan to save the lives of untold thousands during a 7-year famine, a plan to reform and to reunite a family out of a family feud, right? Joseph's family was a dysfunctional family, right? And out of this family feud emerges the family of God. Here's an expression of that same family right here today. A plan to save that family and to give them the land of Goshen in Egypt that would give rise to a new people, the Hebrews, the nation of Israel, the Jews. A plan with Joseph's life being a part of it to fulfill the covenant that God had made with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, that I will make you a great people, right? I mean, everyone loves that. Everybody wants to be blessed. But what's the Abrahamic covenant of Genesis chapter 12? I will bless you so that what? You can be a blessing. For many of us, we want the first part, we don't want the second part. We want all the benefits, but we don't want the responsibility, realizing that the beauty of the responsibility is what gives us ultimate joy. There's a plan. There is a plan for this family to become a nation of men and women that will be a light to the Gentiles, men and women like Moses and Joshua, Ruth, David, Daniel, Esther, and this young maiden named Mary who connects with this other guy named Joseph in the New Testament, right? These are not the same Josephs, right? And Mary and Joseph, their story, God's plans for them, out of that emerges what? Jesus. God is all about you, but he's not just all about you. God has plans for you, but they're part of the plan. A plan for that nation to be a priestly people out of which would come the Savior of the world, from whom would come a new society, Paul tells us. This group called the church. I'm going to describe someone, and you tell me if this is Joseph or if this is someone else that you might recognize. He was dearly loved by his father. He was a shepherd of his father's sheep. He was hated by his brother, stripped of his clothing, sold for the price of a slave, taken to Egypt, falsely accused, bound in chains, condemned with criminals. Yet, after he suffered, he was highly exalted. He was 30 years old when he began his public service. He wept for his brothers. He forgave those who had wronged him, and ultimately he saved them from certain death. Moreover, what people did to hurt him, God turned around for good. Remind you of someone? In my study for today's sermon, I found an article that listed over 60 parallels between Joseph and Jesus. Did God have a plan for Joseph? Yes. Was Joseph successful? Yes. But in your pursuit, do not forget obedience. Do not forget holiness. And do not forget that there's a plan. Let's pray. Our Father, thank you that the plan included us. And there are people who are part of this plan, gathered in big rooms like this, hiding in small rooms, out under trees, all over the world. And out of this story comes this family with this purpose, to be a light to the nations. May you find us not merely successful. May you find us